I'm going to start with another poem by Denise Levertov. And this one is called, it's the first in a series that she did on Julian of Norwich. This would actually be a wonderful resource for y'all. It's the collection is called The Stream and the Sapphire. It's selected poems by Denise Levertov, and it would be actually, I can recommend this as something that y'all could study together as a group. Julian, there are vast gaps we call black holes, unable to picture what's both dense and vacant. And there's the dizzying multiplication of all language can name or fail to name, unutterable swarming of molecules. All Pascal imagined he could not stretch his mind to imagine is known to exceed his dread. And there's the earth of our daily history, its memories, its present filled with the grain of one particular scrap of carpentered wood we happen to be next to, its waking light on one especial leaf, this word or that, a tune in this key, not another, beat of our hearts now, good or bad, dying or being born, eroded, vanishing. And you ask us to turn our gaze inside out and see a little thing the size of a hazelnut and believe it is our world? Ask us to see it lying in God's pierced palm, that it encompasses every awareness our minds contain, all time, all limitless space given form in this medieval enigma? Yes, this is indeed what you ask, sharing the mystery you were shown. All that is made, a little thing, the size of a hazelnut, held safe in God's pierced palm. I just thought of something else that I want to make sure I say to y'all during this time. So I'm grateful to have received questions last night, during, but also after our session together. And I just told Ashley that she said, how'd you sleep? And I said, I didn't, because I was thinking, you had so many good questions. I was thinking so much last night when I got back to the hotel. And so my brain is percolating and I'm thinking about the questions you asked. So one of the things that Ashley drove me to the hotel last night, and one of the things that we were both noting is how Julian writes in a way that is the way Nicholas Watson puts it, is that she writes a speculative vernacular theology. One of the things I noticed when I first read Julian the first time in 1999 was that she uses the term like a lot. That's the translation from the Middle English. She uses the term like. It was like this. It was as if this. And I thought she kind of writes like a valley girl. Like there's a, like this, like that. It's kind of, But what I came to understand as I read her more and understood more about how she was thinking through what she saw, is she was thinking about how best to convey visions that came to her so vividly for someone who didn't have the visions. And so we're gonna get to the vision on the servant and the Lord today, and it was a vision that she didn't write about in her first short text. she, over a decade, or we don't know exactly how long, thought about what she'd seen and then wrote about it in this whole section that's in the long text that we don't have in the short text. So we're going to get to that. I want to tell you also that I had to keep this aspect of Julian in mind as I wrote this little book. So this little book, there's a quote attributed usually to Mark Twain that I've written you a short letter, and if I'd had longer, I would have written a shorter letter, something like that. I wrote a short book on purpose over the course of a very long time. I wanted it to be, for one thing, I didn't want it to be longer than her text. That didn't seem right for me to, at the time, it didn't. I'm sure there are people who write longer books on her, but I wanted to make her book accessible to a general reader. But here is one of the reasons why it took me a while to bring this into the world, was that in 2011, I went through a divorce, and I was the ethics professor at Duke University. And I was teaching a class with 160 students, and I had to get up, and there was no way it wasn't going to become a topic of conversation, and tell my students that I was going to keep teaching them ethics even while they saw something of what some of them would consider a failure. And I had already written a book on Julian of Norwich. I had a whole text. And about a year after or so, I went back and read my words, somewhere between 6 months and a year, and I thought, this is all wrong. This is all wrong. I have misunderstood her understanding of suffering, and I've come pretty close to suggesting that suffering itself is redemptive. There were reasons for that, but I had to put that whole manuscript, I just had to be like, okay, let's start over. So this book is my own, also speculative vernacular theology, as I thought through how to think in clearer terms about what she had written after having taught her for a very long time with students who asked me all sorts of questions about her suffering. Something to know about her request to God, her request to the crucifix, that she experienced in a bodily way God's perspective on Jesus' suffering. It was not unusual at this time. It was not unusual for people seeking to experience Jesus Christ, for people to ask to feel Jesus in their blood and bones. That was not unusual. And while some people read her as having asked more for suffering, she is already suffering, and then she asks for Jesus to be revealed in her suffering. And on the cards on your tables, there's a quote on the back from a review, and this might be one way for you to remember. I'm not telling you to buy the book again. I'm not saying that. That's not it. I'm not telling you to buy my book. But Karen Kilby, whose name is on there, and so you can write down her name. If you look up a video of her, look up her name, it's on YouTube, look up her name and look up her video. It's got suffering in the title. It's got suffering in the title. And from my perspective of your questions last night, after the session and during the session, I think you're going to be able to get through that video. She begins by talking about a theologian that it doesn't matter if you know who she's talking about. She she gives a very helpful correction to a tendency within some forms of Christian theology to think that suffering itself is redemptive. And it's an excellent systematic treatment of that question. So I can it's about 30 minutes. I'm not asking you to watch 2 hours. But there are going to be questions some of you are going to have after this session, and it's Karen Kilby I would send you to. She's also written on Julian. Does it say like suffering, sin, and redemption or something? And that's it. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, it would definitely be worth a whole series just to view what she has to say and think through what she's correcting and how her corrections are helpful. Okay, so as I was working on that rewrite of this book, one of the concepts that I wanted so much to figure out how to explain is that in her visions, she comes over time to see love in everything. And I grew up going to a United Methodist Church, junior high and high school in San Angelo, and I had learned through singing, through confirmation, that God is all-powerful, so God is omnipotent, that God is all-knowing, and that's going to be in the sermon tomorrow, by the way, from the Gospel of John, chapter 4, that God is all-knowing, God's omniscient. One of the things that Julian writes is what I came to describe God's omniamity. It's a word I made up. God's omniamity, God's all-lovingness. That is the point at which I stop. That is the point at which I have trouble living into that truth. God is omnipotent, check. God is omniscient, check. God is all-loving? Not sure about that one. And not completely sure I want that. So, Julian also sees sin as a no thing. And that's one of the questions that one of your colleagues brought last night. Julian sees sin as a no thing, a nothing, as a void. And that is one of the aspects of her visions that people find not just problematic, but offensive. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. Okay. So this is in her short text. If you decide you want to buy the Penguin edition that I highly recommend, it is on page 34 and 35. It is the 23rd section of the short text. After this, the fiend came again with his heat and his stench and distressed me greatly. The stench was so vile and so agonizing, and the physical heat was terrifying and tormenting. And I also heard a human jabbering as if there were two people, and it seemed to me that both of them were jabbering at once, as if they were having a very tense discussion. And it was all quiet muttering, and I could understand nothing they said. Honestly, it sounds like a horror movie, a very sophisticated horror movie. But I thought that all this was to drive me to despair, and I trusted firmly in God and comforted my soul by speaking aloud as I would have done to another person who was distressed like this. Isn't that good advice? I trusted firmly in God and comforted my soul by speaking aloud as I would have done to another person who was distressed like this. I thought that this anxiety could not be compared to any other human anxiety. I set my bodily eyes on the same cross in which I had seen comfort before, and my tongue to speaking of Christ's passion and reciting the faith of Holy Church. And I fixed my heart on God with all my trust and with all my strength, and I thought to myself, you must now be very careful to hold to the faith, if only from now on you could always be so careful to keep yourself from sin. It would be a beneficial and good way of life. For I truly thought that if I were safe from sin, I would be quite safe from all the fiends of hell and enemies of my soul. And so they kept me occupied all that night and in the morning until it was just after sunrise. And then at once they were all gone and passed away, leaving nothing but a stench, and that persisted for a while. And I thought of them with contempt. And thus I was delivered from them by the power of Christ's passion, for that is how the fiend is overcome, as Christ said to me before. Ah, wretched sin, what are you? You are nothing. For I saw that God is all things. I saw nothing of you. And when I saw that God has made all things, I saw nothing of you. And when I saw that God is in all things, I saw nothing of you. And when I saw that God does all things that are done, greater and lesser, I saw nothing of you. And when I saw our Lord Jesus sitting so gloriously in our souls and loving and liking and ruling and guiding all that he has made, I saw nothing of you. And so I am certain that you are nothing, and all those who love you and like you and follow you and choose you at the end, I am certain that they will be brought to nothing with you and endlessly overthrown. God protect us all from you. Amen, for the love of God. And that's in the text. Amen, for the love of God. So one of the things I note in my book that I gave I don't know if I note this part, but I gave a talk on Julian of Norwich at Princeton Seminary, and I wasn't exactly sure. This was before the book came out, and I wasn't exactly sure what to title the talk, and I thought it'd be clever to call it The Bloody Truth. I thought that'd be kind of clever on the bloody truth. But in the midst of the talk, somebody asked me, like, is that really the best title for what you're describing? And I said, well, the other idea I had was laughing at the devil. And they were like, that's it. So I have to give complete credit to the people who were in that lecture at Princeton Seminary, that what I needed to name the book was Laughing at the Devil. And that image came to me when I was in a car, sitting in the parking lot of the Duke Federal Credit Union with both of my daughters in the car with me. They were both teenagers. They're 6 years apart, but there's a song that they both love, and I won't go into all the details of the song, but in the song, the artist, she laughs with such just complete abandon, just absolutely laughs, like Sandra Bullock laughs, right, with a snort. You know, Sandra, she does that. She'll snort while she's laughing. And that laughter, I thought, that's the laughter that Julian laughs at the devil with, is a laugh of abandon and freedom and safety. Another image that you might keep in mind, for those of you who are about my age, is the song Safety Dance. Is it safe to dance? So one of the questions some people will ask is what are you willing to die for? And I think Julian can also ask us, what are we willing to dance for? How are we called to believe that sin is so much no thing that we do not fear shame? And here is the correction I found as I was thinking about the question of sin being no thing. So there is a scholar who's at Duke, he's not yet retired, named David Ayres, who is a scholar of medieval texts, medieval English texts. This is his bailiwick. This is what he does. His last name is Aers, if you want to look up his writing. And he had written on Julian that her visions do not take suffering sufficiently into account, and that her understanding of sin as a nothing cannot address the evils we genuinely face in the world. So he had written on Julian a much more academic version of my first reaction when someone said, well, you should assign Julian of Norwich. You know her, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And I thought, and I may have even said, no, I don't know her, and she sounds stupid. So what David Ayres wrote was a very analytically keen explanation for why Julian's visions are insufficient to deal with sin and evil in this world. So a perspective that I have sympathy for. Here is what, as I kept reading her texts and thinking through the tone of her text, and in the passage I just read to you, you are nothing. You are nothing. One of the ways to perceive her visions of sin as no thing is from the underside of power. So when we look at an image of Julian that is sort of more stylized and has her in a coif, rather than, I don't know, in an apron, or I don't know what image to use. But one way to think about her that is a mistake is to think of her as being high up in the hierarchy of England at this time. We have no evidence that that's the case. And again, her text is written in the vernacular, which was a text, her words are in the vernacular, the language, English, not being the language of the aristocracy at this time. So rather than thinking about her, and this is a little conceptually dense, so hang in with me. If you need to get up and get more coffee or get up and move around, I will not be offended. So one way to think about what she's seeing is to think about the visions as coming to her after the peasants have been the people who are in the peasant class have been mown down by mice, mown down like mice, after their repeated revolts against this brutally hierarchical system, and after a time when, in her childhood, so many people had died unshriven, had died in a way that by the official doctrine they would not be saved. So one of the ways to think about this time and her visions is her vision of sin as not ultimately having the power, and God having power over all that is, including the dueling popes, including the hierarchy of, as she continues to call it, Mother Church. Thinking about that, the machinations of the people in power not having the ultimate say. It changes the tone of what she's envisioned. She's envisioned an at-oneing, a kinning, a familial setting in which we are bled together, made into family together, and no longer, if we receive the vision that she's written to us about, no longer tempted to push against one another in order to save ourselves from a brutal regime. Because this was a brutal regime. There's no mistaking that. A detail, I'll give an aside here, a detail that Fritz Bauerschmidt writes in his book on Julian of Norwich, his writings in time, is he gives a detail. So during this time, the laity didn't receive the blood, and the body of Jesus was to be received in very strict order of hierarchy. So imagine if your priest instructed you that the biggest givers in the church, even if they only come on Easter, the biggest givers in the church will come forward first. And then in appropriate, who gets on the airplane first on a British Airways flight, right? So very clear, but without the children getting to come first. So very, very clear guidelines, rules, laws. And Fritz Bauerschmidt gives detail that during the Peace of Christ celebration, the Pax Christi celebration, where the host, the bread was to be the body was to be held up, that there's a detail of one of the men pulling a sword and threatening another man because one of his neighbors was coming forward to kiss the peace bread before him, and strictly he was supposed to be behind him in the order of procession to kiss the peace bread. Yeah, yuck. Yuck. Okay, in that setting, then, imagine these visions in which Julian is receiving the blood straight from Jesus. And Julian has the blood flowing unaccountably, just flowing profligately into all of us, making us one. There's a term that some people who do work, and please feel free not to put this on social media, although I'm already on record all over the place saying it. So there's a term that people who teach critical race theory, which I highly recommend learning, critical race theory. There are people who teach critical race theory and who do work on power systems of race, gender, class. There's a term that I don't know who came up with the term first, but it's very helpful. The term is horizontal violence. Horizontal violence. And if you've lived through junior high in Texas, you might have experienced something like this, where when under a system of scrutiny and relative powerlessness, one of the reactions that some of us can engage in is to distinguish ourselves. I am not like that person. To distinguish ourselves and to be clear. Oh, that's so good to see them. Yeah, I almost said Mean Girls are really good at this. Like that kind of like distinguishing ourselves. Like I am not one of those. I am different. I'm different. That in the midst of scrutiny and relative powerlessness, one of the reactions that human beings seem capable of having is a very, very, sometimes very cruel and carefully wrought divide and conquer. So you've heard the term divide and conquer? It's something that we see a lot right now, but it's in other settings, not just in the treatment of faculty at places like Duke. But that is one way that I answer back to David Ayers in my book. And let me see if I can find that section, because I probably worked really hard on that section. I might as well read it to you. Okay. Is anybody else allergic to ragweed? Oh my gosh, yeah. Okay. Oh, this is a different section from Ayers, but it's helpful. I might come back to that. Okay, so we'll get to the servant and the Lord section in a second, but okay, in his introduction to his translation of Julian's texts, A.C. Spearing reads her parable on the servant and Lord as allowing, I'm sorry, I'm sniffling into the microphone. A.C. Spearing reads her parable of the servant and the Lord as allowing Julian to see reality as God sees it. To see reality as God sees it. The orthodox solution, this is a quote, the orthodox solution to the problem of predestination, orthodox small o, solution to the problem of predestination and free will was that for God, who exists in eternity, past and future coexist in an eternal present to which the present of this brief and fleeting moment is the nearest human equivalent. In the parable of the servant and the Lord, Julian apprehends this divine vision of reality not as theory, but as experience. I better tell you a little bit about the servant and the Lord before so I'm going to just jump to the section on David Ayers, and we'll come back to the servant and the Lord passage. So this aspect of Julian's vision is a scandal. From one perspective, she has made God so cozy or so familiar that God becomes powerless or unjust. Like a parent who loves her children so much that she cannot bring herself to discipline them while they injure one another. Some readers have found offense in a slightly different angle. They read her as violating the basic conception of human justice. By that reading, humans are left with no recourse to name and resist oppression. Seen from this angle, Julian's vision reflects Julian's inability to reckon with human responsibility for the horror humans inflict on one another. If I read him correctly, this is how David Ayers judges Julian in his book, Salvation and Sin. He writes that by collapsing the will to sin, the choices against divine grace are assimilated into the language of pain, of suffering, for which there is no blame. Ayers is concerned that the strategy here systematically diminishes human responsibility for evil and equally systematically banishes the discourse of divine justice as though this might be in conflict with divine love. Julian's theology, and I'm quoting from Ayers, does not, probably cannot, address collective life and its domination by will and power alienated from God and the covenants. It cannot address the stuff of the earthly city. Her visions, by his reading, are anemic. Given that the sins of collective life are often driven by what Ayers terms domination, she seems to him to have drained all the blood out of the atonement. What I have found as I have read her and taught her again and again and again is that Julian does not ignore domination and oppression and the horrors we inflict on one another. She addresses the sins of collective life that gather like poisonous fungi on the underside of domination. Her visions do not deny justice. Her visions redirect us away from a cycle of reinforced order that depends on divine anger and a threat of retribution. When we are scared that we or our children are going to be beheaded or relegated to starvation, when we are reminded in hidden or obvious ways that we are, in the reckoning of those leaders responsible for calculating the worth of people beneath them, truly no more important than our mercantilist use value, then our response may be to scramble for survival in the worst possible ways. When we realize that to the people who seem to be in charge of how things work, we are less important than squirrels on a highway, we do not necessarily react by banding together to fight the powers that be. In history, as I have read it, people who suffer under the boot of other human beings who have been taught to consider themselves above the fray are as likely to commit perpetual and creative cruelties against one another as they are to band together in solidarity against the boot on top of them. This is the thing that some people have called horizontal violence. People subject to the powers that have everything to gain by keeping things tragically unequal can turn on one another and on their own souls, hating themselves and one another because that is easier, in one way, easier than feeling the profound sense of nonsense that is perpetually reinforced injustice. During times of natural disaster or social instability, the pressure to cohere and conform can tighten, and people can be drawn to the worst sort of self-harm and malice, even towards those they are supposed to love most. Julian answers this.